Hi, everybody. Welcome to the Hammer Museum. I'm Claudia Bester. I'm the Director of Public Programs here, and I'm delighted to welcome you to tonight's Hammer Forum on the how and why of political advertising with Fernando Guerra and John Thomas, and our moderator tonight is Jessica Levinson. Before we get started, I want to remind you to please silence your cell phones, and we are videotaping tonight. We'll put it up on our website, so no need for any of you to videotape or anything during the program. I also want to quickly mention some upcoming Hammer programs you might be interested in. Tomorrow night, you can come celebrate Valentine's Day with us here at the Hammer with a free screening of the Academy Award-winning film Moonlight. Next Thursday, February 20th, is our next Constitution Happy Hour, which is kind of like a book club, but we all read the Constitution. You all get free copies of the Constitution, and we have a cash bar and constitutional scholars to guide us. On February 23rd, Jane Fonda will be here talking about her climate change activism. And on February 26th, Rick Hasson and Kristen Clark will be here talking about ways that voting systems can go wrong, whether accidentally or by being manipulated. And you're all invited to our Super Tuesday viewing party beginning at 5:30 p.m. on Election Day, March 3rd, to see the results from the presidential primaries, as well as a number of critical state and local elections. And if you haven't registered to vote yet, it's not too late. I believe you have until Monday. We have voter registration cards in the back of the room. You can also ask an usher, but please make sure you're registered to vote. And hey, you can come to the Hammer and vote because we're going to be a polling place. So come hang out with us all day on March 3rd. The next Hammer Forum is on March 17th, where we're going to be talking about family separation policies at the U.S. border with Mexico. So we have a lot going on this season, and we hope you'll come back for some of our upcoming free programs. If you want to receive reminder emails, make sure you're signed up for our email list. You can always talk to an usher about that. And you can also find recordings of most of our past programs on the Hammer website. So on to tonight's program. The Hammer Forum is a monthly series of public discussions about current social and political issues, and it's made possible with support from the Rosenblum family. Tonight's forum is a discussion about how spending has changed in elections over the past 2 decades, and whether or not all the money swirling around in politics is effective, and how is this all impacted by social media and by Citizens United? Is all the money distorting the democratic process, and does it even work? Our guest speakers are here to break it all down for us. Dr. Fernando Guerra is the director of the Center for the Study of Los Angeles at Loyola Marymount University, where he's also a professor of political science and Chicano studies. His area of scholarly work is in local governance, urban politics, and racial and ethnic politics. Dr. Guerra has been a principal investigator in over 20 major studies on Los Angeles, leadership studies, and electoral politics. He's the principal investigator of the largest general social survey in the Los Angeles region. He has served on standing commissions, blue ribbon committees, and ad hoc task forces for the city of LA, the state of California, and regional bodies in Southern California. He's a sought-after source for the media at the local, national, and international level. John Thomas is a top political strategist and the host of the podcast, The Thomas Guide. Great name. For those of us who remember and love the Thomas Guide. He's also the founder and president of Thomas Partners Strategies, a Republican strategy and advertising firm running high-profile races all over the country. The LA Times called Thomas Billy Kid of political battles for his aggressive campaign style and his ability to win in tough political climates. He was also given Campaign and Election Magazine's Rising Star of 2017 award. He's the official political analyst for KFI AM 640 radio and can frequently be seen on Fox News, providing analysis and insight into the country's most pressing issues and races. Our moderator tonight is Jessica Levinson. She's a professor of law at Loyola Law School, where she's also the founding director of the Loyola Law Public Service Institute, which trains the next generation of leaders in government service. Levinson studies the law of the political process, including election law and governance issues. Her work focuses on ethics, political corruption, voting rights, campaign finance, ballot initiatives, redistricting, term limits, and state budgets. Until last year, she served as the president of the Los Angeles Ethics Commission, and previously she served as director of political reform at the Center for Governmental Studies, a nonprofit research organization that looks at ethics and campaign financing. She has a weekly legal segment on KCRW's Press Play and frequently contributes op-ed pieces to NBC.com. So now, without further ado, please join me in welcoming Fernando Guerra, John Thomas, and Jessica Levinson.
Thank you so much for being here. I'm really excited about doing this, and I'm really excited about doing it with John and Fernando, who, as I said to them earlier today, I picked because they are the best at what they do. And so this is a topic that's so near and dear to my heart. When I started out deciding whether or not to go to law school, I cared most about the intersection of politics and the law and election law and campaign spending. And so what we're going to talk about today is a couple of different things. I'm going to start really briefly, I promise, talking about the lay of the land when it comes to the legal landscape of campaign finance law. And then we're going to get to what John and Fernando would describe as the really interesting part, which is the nuts and bolts of campaign spending, what makes an effective ad. And then finally, because this might be our only time together before we vote, we're going to talk about what's on the March 3rd ballot. And I do want to plug, I already filled out my ballot, but I do plan to vote here because I think it is so cool that the Hammer is doing that. So I'm going to talk about, I usually teach a class in campaign finance law. It's about 26 hours of class. I'm going to do it in about 3.5 minutes, I think, and hope. I could just interpretive dance it, but I think every dance teacher I've ever had would ask that I not do that. So, first thing that I want to talk about is when we're discussing campaign finance law, why are we actually talking about First Amendment law? And that's because one of the most important things to know and think about when we're talking about political spending is that we consider how much you give a candidate, how much you give an outside group, how much you give a political party, and how much those people spend, how much the candidate spends, the political party spends, the outside group spends, to be some form of speech. So that means whenever the government tries to limit how much you can give, how much you can spend, we have to do a First Amendment analysis. And we have to ask, basically, can the government prevent you from speaking? If there's one thing that I want my students to take away from campaign finance law, one thing to remember is that the Supreme Court in 1976, in a case that's way more important than Citizens United, said money is either speechy when it comes to contribution limits or speech when it comes to expenditures. And that's why we have our current system. That's why we have a system where you can limit how much you can give to a candidate, you can limit how much you can give to a political party, you can no longer limit how much you can give to most outside groups, but you can't limit how much each of those people spend because we think that's a direct assault on speech. I'll save for a podcast that only my parents will listen to why I think that's exactly the wrong answer, but that's why we have the current system. That's why John can spend unlimited sums of money on behalf of his candidates because there can never be a ceiling for how much they can spend. There can never be a ceiling for how much the PACs can spend. That's the first part. I'm halfway done, I promise. Second part, so why do we, when we think about Citizens United, or even when we think about campaign finance law, Citizens United is the case that we think about. And that case essentially says corporations, you have to be treated the same way that individuals are treated. It doesn't say corporations are individuals. There's a whole line of corporate rights that's separate. But it says that because what the Supreme Court said is when we're talking about speech, we care about you, the voter, and the listener. And we don't care about the identity of the speaker. So it doesn't matter if it's corporate speech, it doesn't matter if it's an individual speech. We're going to treat that the same. If an individual can't be limited, then a corporation can't be limited. What happened after Citizens United, there was a lower court decision that said basically, and now we can no longer limit how much you can give to these outside groups. So that created, what's our current framework? Now it's the last day of class. Our current framework is you can limit how much you can give to candidates, to some outside groups, a little bit to political parties, though I suspect if we gave this talk in 5 years, that would not be true, or even 3 years. But corporations can spend unlimited sums as long as it's, quote, independent of the candidate. Independence is a word that's doing a lot of work there. Political parties can spend unlimited sums, and candidates can spend unlimited sums. And that's why we live in a system where political advertising matters so much. In other democracies, what do we have? A system where you can limit how much you can spend on campaigning. We limit how much you could, where you can limit how much you can spend in terms of time. We only have this election season. Think of Canada. It's from here to there. You'd be out of business. And that's it. We have a system in place in our country, again, for the reason that we say money is speech, and that fundamentally changes every election in our country. Every election for mayor, for state assembly, for governor. Imagine what a different world it would be if people were limited, candidates were limited in how much they could spend. You're not on an endless fundraising treadmill. I'm sorry, it's not a world that's ever gonna happen, don't worry. And how much outside groups can spend. Their influence is vastly reduced. It fundamentally and seismically changes the way you campaign. So that was introduction and conclusion to campaign finance law. Next thing is, how many people do we think give some money in federal elections? What percentage of the population? 10%. 7. This is like an auction house, except it's the reverse. You have to go lower, not higher. 1. Oh, no, I don't give answers here. No, I'm going to give you an answer. I made slides. So we think 1% give some money. What percentage do we think give the maximum contribution to a federal candidate, which is $2,700? 0.1. Who's that cynical person over there? Hi. All right. I'm not that great at PowerPoint. This is from the Center for Responsive Politics. Their website is opensecrets.org. They're a great resource. I lifted it directly from them. I want to give attribution. So the percentage of the US population giving $200 or more, 0.47. Giving $2,700 or more, basically meaning maybe they maxed out to one candidate and then they gave to a party, 0.07%. Now, numbers alone don't say that there's a problem. So what we have to ask ourselves is, does that create a problem? And if so, what is the problem? Now, I just spent a little bit of time talking about the importance of money in politics. Very few people actually participate in that particular enterprise. Okay, I have great guests here, so I'm gonna keep going. Outside spending. This is one thing that I wanna highlight because campaigns in America have fundamentally changed recently. 2002, for me, is not that long ago. It's not, it's not 1940. And so look at the trend line. Where is Citizens United? Outside money plays a huge role in our political system. And without further ado, so we have 2 amazing guests. As I said to them this morning, this is going to be better than a cable news network. So we're gonna talk about, no slam on that, but we agree vehemently on a lot of things. We disagree vehemently on a lot of things. And what we're going to talk about is the ins and outs of campaign spending. And we are going to do you a favor and leave any partisan bickering to the side. So the first thing I want to do is start with kind of where we left off when I just talked about campaign finance law, which is, and John, I'll start with you and then I'll sit down. how does election spending affect our elections? Meaning, think about, and I know that your stomach's going to turn, but think about an alternative universe where, for instance, we have public financing.
I was just going to say, Jessica, you gave such a good. First of all, thank you for having me. It's great to be here. You just convinced me that public financing is the way to go. The corporations shouldn't have speech. We can get off on a. I don't know where you're on. You guys are on that issue, but I am so vehemently against public financing because it discourages the underdog and in favors incumbents. And I don't like incumbents in general. I'm just on that reason alone. I
Or
hate
people,
public.
but yes.
Well, that's true. But I'm anti-public fantasy. I mean, money's everything. The very first thing I do when I run campaigns every day, and the very first thing I do when I join a campaign is I sit down with the budget. And I look at how much money either do we start with. Usually we're starting with zilch or close to it, and then project out how much money do we need to do the bare minimum. How much money we think we can reasonably raise, and sometimes it's really a guessing game. And then I think about how much money do my opponents have, and then how much money do outside groups have, and how does that all fit in the matrix? So money to us really allows, the more money we have, it's not just the more TV ads we can buy. It's the more bells and whistles you get to have. And we can perhaps get into this later on in the talk, but when you have more money, there are such sophisticated ways of using analytics and targeting to deliver the targeted messages to the audience. But if you don't have money, the very first thing you start to do is stripping away all those bells and whistles so you can just, we call it painting lead on the target, so you can just get the message out. So money is everything, and it's not just to pay high-priced consultants like me, but it's really our ability to deliver a message.
Fernando, same question to you, but maybe a little different focus on how does campaign spending and the huge influx of the private money that John lives and dies on affect our political process and affect voting?
So first of all, I want to know where your parents are. Okay.
Hello.
You can blame them later.
Yes. Yeah. Well, no, I just want you to be calm and nice, and your parents are here. So don't do what you usually do to me in public. Berate me. So I totally disagree with John. I totally think that money in politics distorts our narrative, and distorts the results, and therefore public policy and our quality of life. I do agree with him a little bit about the public financing. In general, in principle, I'm for it. I don't know that I necessarily agree with your conclusion, but I don't know that I have a conclusion. I'm very ambivalent about how would public financing work and what would the unintended consequences be. And I'm not, in everything that I've read and studied, not convinced by most of the recommendations for public finance that they would be able to have the impact that they suggest. I'm still looking for that unicorn of what that would be. And definitely campaigns have drastically changed with independent expenditures, where John, and by the way, he's a Republican consultant, but what he described is exactly what Democratic consultants do as well. So that's not a partisan way of approaching campaigns. Both parties do that. But the independent expenditures has created a completely different aspect to it, that you then have to take a look at what are they going to do. You're not supposed to coordinate, but you know they're there. And they are communicating to each other, but in public where everybody can see, and they're messaging and they can pick up each other's message. And so that I think just has the spiral effect of much, much more money. Another trend, almost as important from my perspective as independent expenditures, is the new technologies of raising money. Bernie Sanders' ability to raise money the way he's doing has changed politics, in my mind, even to a greater degree than independent expenditures, and much quicker. No matter what happens with Bernie in Nevada or South Carolina, or even on Super Tuesday, he could keep going because he has that money. And he controls that money, unlike independent expenditures. So you have the trend of all these court decisions, number one, and number two, the independent expenditures, and then number three, this new way of raising money has changed campaigns and campaign finance more in the last 6 to 7 years, and your graph showed it, than in the previous 75 years, I would say.
Do you want to respond?
I mean, I do, well, we can get into a public finance argument, but I'm happy to have that argument. But to your point, I really don't disagree with the small dollar shift in politics. I actually think that the Democratic Party, Tom Perez, did a greater disservice to perhaps killing off the diversity of his field with his arbitrarily selected small donor requirement thresholds to get on the debate stage. Because what they've never seen that before. I think they should have done it like the Republicans last cycle, which is just a polling threshold. You have you have the varsity and the JV debate teams, and if you can work your way up in the polling averages, you get to play with the big boys. In this case,
Or girls,
yeah. In this case, what you saw, a lot of these campaigns were spending unbelievable acquisition costs where they would lose money on getting small donors. So to geek out for a second here, since we're talking campaign finance, average small donor acquisition costs on a campaign that we'll be involved in is anywhere from $1.50 per donor to $3 to $4 a donor. That's for on average of a life cycle of the campaign for a $10 donor. So maybe they give you $1 up front, but you resolicit, you get $10. I haven't seen the stats in the last month or so, but going into Iowa, these campaigns, because they were so desperate to qualify for the debate, because if you're not on the debate, it's a kiss of death. We're spending upwards of $40 to $70 for a $10 donor. So they were flushing all of their cash down the drain, like a Cory Booker, a Kamala Harris, so that they could qualify for the debate to live another day, which causes a person like me, when I'm looking at the budget, what does that mean, Fernando? It means I can't build out a field infrastructure program and make the key hires in Iowa that I'm going to need a year from now because, God forbid, I don't get on the debate stage. So I actually think that arbitrary number did more damage and favored older, more establishment figures that had this evergreen supply of small donors. But that's my 2 cents.
So I want to pick up on this issue of small donors. And yes, it played a really big role in the debates, obviously, because it was part of the qualifying threshold. But
no longer, by the way. You notice they changed that for Bloomberg.
For Bloomberg. And we have to talk about
just
Bloomberg.
so unfair, in my opinion. But
I'm sorry for your loss. So I think that the debate requirements, in a way, followed what was a trend of how many candidates have we heard say, I have so many small donors. I have all the grassroots donors. I care about I'm building a grassroots movement. And so it feels to me like that was a outgrowth of the Democratic Party basically messaging, look, this percentage of my donors are $50 and under. So I want to get back to one thing about the graph, which is, what does it mean for our political system when we have 0.07% of people as big players, so to speak? So Fernando, I'll go to you first.
Well, again, and I think you lecture about this. Who gives money? Who are they? And why do they do that? And a small percentage give it because they actually believe in the candidate, the ideology, et cetera. But a lot of them believe that that political party or that candidate will pursue their interests. And obviously that graph's going to show you whose interest is that. It's it's not even the 1%, it's the 0.5%, right? And that's who gives, and that's whose interest they expect the candidate and the party to follow. And so that's, I think, very clear to me.
And is that changing with new fundraising techniques, you think?
Not the percentage of the total, but I think it's changing for instance, for Bernie Sanders, it's completely changing, and he's using it in the campaign against the billionaires, and it's changing the narrative of how we talk about campaign donors.
John, do you want to talk about the negative pervasive influence of private money in the political system?
I would say, I always tell my candidates, it's nice if we have the most money, but money isn't everything. Ask Jeb how that went in 2016. He had over $100 million. Didn't work out.
Or Whitman here in California.
I mean, there are countless examples. I can talk about races where I was outspent 5-1 and still prevailed. So there are plenty.
But the vast majority still win, right?
Typically, when you spend more, you typically you do typically win.
I think just to contextualize that, I think the lower the office, the more money you would win. And as
Yeah.
you start getting to the U.S. Senate and presidential,
Right.
then money is not, whoever spends the most money is not automatically the winner. But for the U.S. House, a lot more so. For county supervisor or city council, a lot more so.
Yeah, to put a finer point on that, I agree. It's in the lower information contests when we have the demise, other than Hammer forums, we have the demise of civic forums and print newspapers where people just can't get information, or maybe they're not interested. I'm not sure which chicken or the egg there, but they can't learn about these candidates. So the candidate that can advertise and advertise the most, specifically like in LA County. I mean, you look at running for sheriff or any of these countywide offices, you can be the best candidate since sliced bread, but if you can't deliver your message to the voters, and it's hugely expensive, and it's not like you say, oh, well, I know what I'll do. I'll buy one ad where everybody's listening. No. You need to buy an ad every single hour, and because you need to have the repetition. So just even having enough to play ball is oftentimes determinant of who wins in some of these geographically large contests.
But in LA County, you could be the best sliced bread, but you got to be a tortilla to really win. It's like
That's helpful.
That's the challenge.
Demographically, that is a helpful thing here. Yeah.
All right. Staying on the theme of Mexican food. No, I have no follow-up to that whatsoever. But staying on the theme of, is money determinative? Yeah. So we just talked about the fact that the candidate with the most money doesn't always win.
But usually does.
Yes.
High percentage.
So let's talk about...
Well, just to play the devil's advocate here, that's true.
That's
but
your role. You're the Republican.
Well, but I also find that money very often is attracted to the perceived winner.
True.
So when we like to say, like, winning begets winning. If people perceive you're a winner, they back a winner.
Front runner.
They're a front runner. And so what we do a lot in our campaigns on day one is we call it peacocking. We come out and we do a big launch video, and if we have a poll, we tell how we're, oh my God, we're leading by this amount, whether we are or we aren't. We try to spin a story, and it's all about convincing that small percentage of people that are likely to invest in a district attorney's contest or whatever race we are, that we are the front runner and eventual winner to get their money and then make those polling results a reality. So oftentimes, yes, the candidate has most money, but it's not necessarily they won because they had the most money. It was because they were the front runner dominant candidate anyway.
So you're both talking about prodigious fundraisers. Now there's a candidate who's not raising any money but might be the biggest spender. And so not all candidates who spend the same amount of money are treated alike. We know that self-funding candidates, you mentioned Meg Whitman.
Great example, yeah.
May not always be the same as the candidates who build an infrastructure. Now, you kind of talked about maybe campaign fundraising ability being a proxy for the ability to get votes. But so what do we make of Michael Bloomberg? He can spend more than any of the candidates. He has unlimited sums. He's not raising any money. He's not building an infrastructure. He's not campaigning in the way that we have been accustomed to. So will this be a paradigm shifting moment where what we need in perhaps times of turmoil is, one of the 3 or 6 richest people in the world to step in? Does he stand a chance because of this? Fernando, do you want to go first?
Well, I mean, anybody with $58 billion stands a chance to do anything they want. I mean, that's clearly the case. Yeah, I think he's very fortunate. His strategy is working. At the beginning, I didn't think it was going to, but the results of Iowa and New Hampshire that didn't give us a clear winner, and I think Nevada and South Carolina as well are going to be as muddled, put him in the perfect. I mean, the strategy is working. I didn't think it would work for him, and that money's gonna. You could see the polls in California and elsewhere changing, where he is creeping up little by little, and so he will be a player after Super Tuesday. He will be in the middle in terms of delegate count, and that will allow him to continue past Super Tuesday, and that amount of money is buying it. And I actually disagree with you a little bit. He is building an infrastructure. That's what he is. He is spending a lot of his money in buying people, and something that you never see campaigns do, and I got this from John, is that when he hires campaign workers, he has them until November. he's promised to pay them even if he doesn't get the nomination, et cetera. And this infrastructure's there. And part of what he's saying there is that even if I lose, I'm going to use that infrastructure to try to defeat Donald Trump. So it's a virtual, temporary infrastructure, but that's what campaigns have always been.
I should have said not a fundraising infrastructure. So he's not trying, yes, you're right, but he's not trying to he's not like looking for that ad where he says, I can self-fund, but
He does
look at
have
all the
a
grassroots candidates."
fundraising infrastructure. It's called the Bloomberg Terminal that everybody has to pay.
So if he certainly bought himself a ticket to the big game. I mean, that's clear. What's also clear is, and we'll get into this later, I'm sure, is advertising works. It's amazing when you spend, I think he spent almost $300 million so far. It's amazing that you can create name recognition for yourself. And then if you're smart and use polling to select that messaging, that you can press the right buttons, the right people, and as your image grows, so do you on the ballot. It's a miraculous thing. So is he going to be a top tier contender? For sure. Can he keep going as long as he wants to? Absolutely. In fact, that's why most candidates drop out. It's not for party unity. It's because they can't keep the lights on. Let's be honest. They can't buy the TV ads. They know they're in a death spiral, and their staff around them are saying, boss, you're not paying my check this month, or you can't pay the plane ticket to get to the next state. Or these guys have huge egos. They all do. They would stay in until the last ballot was cast. But they make that determination when they can't afford to go on. Bloomberg and Tom Steyer to some degree have that ability to go on as long as they believe that there's a path. I think I disagree with Fernando. I think Bloomberg is still a long shot. I think he's bought himself a ticket, but I'm just skeptical. And this comes from somebody, I specialize in making television ads. Like, that's what I do. I believe in them. And we'll talk about why I believe in them and why they work. But there's something healthy about having to go through the process in Iowa to create excitement at the gas station with the people that are not in big boardrooms. There's something about having to convince a series of even those small donors to believe in you. There's something about being able to just create this excitement around your candidacy that you can't buy. Now we'll see. This is to me the real test. I knew he'd grow in the ballot. I knew he'd be competitive. But I don't know that Mike Bloomberg can create an enthusiasm and intensity that somebody like even Elizabeth Warren or a Buttigieg or a Bernie has. I don't know that you can buy that, but maybe I'll be wrong there. We'll see.
Okay, so let's talk about television ads, why you believe in them, why they matter. And this is something that I think about a lot with my students. So where do you mostly get your political information? Is it television? Is it...
Are you asking the audience?
Yes. Yes.
Well, what are the options so they don't vote first and then keep changing? Television.
Television, number one. I'm not going to list them all because I'm thinking of them real
Be honest.
Radio.
Okay.
Online. Newspapers.
Online, yeah.
How much attention do you pay to... Newspapers online. All right. How much attention do you pay to paid political advertisements from 0 to 2? 0. 1. 2. This is not good for business.
Shoot, I got it all wrong.
All right, so let's...
Okay, this is not a random sample.
No, this is not a random...
This is not a low information voting group.
Let's
just
talk
be
about a
clear.
really civically engaged group who decide on a Thursday night to come and hear people talk. So one of the things I talk to my students about is, where do you get your information? Do you look to see, is this paid or is this unpaid? And so one of the things I want to ask is, why do TV ads still matter so much? And what could change that? Because my students get information online. They don't have TVs. They don't turn on TVs. Our students talk about their parents watching ads. Mm-hmm. So are we in for a fundamental shift when it comes to the importance of money or information delivery when it comes to campaign ads? Fernando, do you want to go first?
No, I'm going to defer to
all right.
he
the
does it
TV
for a
man,
living.
yeah. Sure. we were just talking about this in the green room. It's really an ever-evolving situation. TV is still king. And I sit around thinking about all day about budget allocations in terms of like where we spend our media. If you have unlimited funds like Mike Bloomberg, it's all of the above. You can't, I mean, if you've been on your tablet, you see a Mike Bloomberg ad, and God help you if you go to his website, because they will put a cookie and a pixel on your computer and you will never rid yourself of a Mike Bloomberg ad. But he has unlimited resources essentially, so it's a different thing. Television advertising still works. We win contests, both high information contests and low information contests all the time, and it's for a couple reasons. It's still a great way to talk to a lot of people quickly. I can deliver, there's other mediums, and each medium has its own place, but specifically broadcast versus cable. When I can buy a spot on Dancing with the Stars, and I can talk to millions and millions of eyeballs with one ad. And I can hit you multiple times again and again and again in a short period of time. We can, what we call, the Nielsen system has a points system, and essentially I can deliver in a period of a 1 week period of time, I can deliver a message that I know is delivered to you when you're a captive audience for 30 seconds or 60 seconds, depending on what I buy. I can deliver a message easily 10, 15 times to you, which tells me as a marketer, I know I'm force feeding down your throat, you're going to remember my message. And if I did my analytics and my polling right, I know before I tell you what I'm about to tell you, whether or not what it does to you on the ballot. Whether you agree with me, whether it burns you down or changes your opinion or not, holds you tight. Like, I already know that prior to delivering it. So TV is just a great way because you can talk to a lot of people. Where we're shifting is digital. First of all, I think video will always be king. But the question of where are people consuming video is changing. So we're finding a shift to, even on TV, shift to cable. And so it's harder to catch those eyeballs. But there's new technologies that we're able to catch those. You start going to digital. We were just, again, talking about this in the green room. It's really, if you had asked me this question a couple months ago, I would have given you an entirely different answer than I'm giving you now. With the recent changes in Facebook, Google, Twitter now not allowing political ads, but Google has dramatically changed my ability as a political marketer, my ability to target. I used to, until a couple months ago, we would create these fancy analytics models, and I could track you on Google. You didn't have to visit my website. I knew who you were, and I knew that you would be sympathetic to my candidate before you've ever even heard of my candidate, and I could track you everywhere you went on the internet just using Google. I could dump it in. Google's now scaled that back and said, actually, we think that might be an invasion of privacy, so we're going to limit what you've done, which I hate as a marketer. But so what it's doing, although digital is where it's still all shifting, digital, instead of the real bragging point about digital was its ability to target, and now it's becoming, to me, another broadcast medium. So just like I look at 24711, I look at digital now as a place that I have to go at a broadcast format.
But is television...
That's a way oversimplification.
Yeah. But what I'm trying to understand, television, whether it's cable or network, is still king, but as a percentage is much lower.
Oh, totally.
Right?
Yeah. I mean, every cycle in terms of the budget, I take off another 5 to 10% of our television budget and put it elsewhere.
And is it just as expensive?
Television?
Yeah.
Oh, yeah. It's really expensive. I mean, in the LA market, we basically broker to do it right $1 million a week. And that's not Bloomberg spend. I mean, I'm just talking like you're running for mayor, you need $1 million a week.
Sorry for asking a
No,
question.
please. That was a good one. Okay, so what makes a good, and Fernando, we're going to lean really heavily on you in a few minutes, so I don't want you to feel like
That's okay.
these are all going to
I'm
John.
used to being ignored.
Not by our students. They always ask for you. I think it's generally my lack of warmth towards them, but it's hard to say. What makes a good campaign ad, and is it different on TV versus online?
Great question. There are fundamental truths, I think, that make a good campaign ad, but the medium totally differs in the kind of ad we're delivering. on your standard broadcast format. Well, let's talk about the general truisms that we try to achieve to make a good ad. First, is it credible and authentic to the candidate? Now, often I think political advertising is some of the worst advertising you'll ever see. Like, and it's often
Everybody agrees with that, right?
I mean, it's bad, and it's amazing that people succeed with such bad advertising as we see. It's one of the reasons I can win when I'm outspent, because you go, oh my gosh, they're outspending you. It's like, well, they're misspending it. They're sending it to the wrong audience at the wrong time, and their message stinks. So getting back, it's really having a credibility and an authenticity on an issue that matters to your voter at that moment in time. So, for instance, homelessness is the top issue in LA County, bar none. Just running an ad saying, I'm going to fix homelessness, a standard marketer may say, hey, that's pretty good. You're speaking to the top issue. You're going to move X amount of people in your column. But what really is the magic is if you come up with a believable and credible component of your candidate's identity and tether it to the why you have credibility to talk about that issue, so that a voter actually believes that you might move the needle on fixing homelessness. It's the marrying of those two that matter. And oftentimes marketers get that wrong. They just say paint lead on the target. The top issue is immigration. Say you're going to build the wall, or whatever district it is. But you don't come up with that credibility. So if we talk about this all the time at my firm, our opponents in a primary will do their polling. It may be blatantly obvious what the voters want to hear. So we're both literally saying the same thing to the voters, but oftentimes we know we're going to win because we see the candidate's ad and there's no credibility and there's no connection to what the candidate is saying about that issue. So we know at a rate of growth, if we're both, let's say we're both starting at scratch for name ID or whatever it is, we know we're going to grow faster. And so anyway, that's an oversimplification, but last thing on the digital side, different animal. Brevity is key. So instead of running 30s or 60-second ads, we're running 15s and 6-second ads, actually, is what we spend a lot of our time, which is just name, issue, until you're blue in the face.
That was more than 6 seconds.
I know. No, it is really hard to create a good, memorable 6-second ad, but also making things memorable and making things personal. The big trend we're seeing now is, which much to my chagrin, I like really well-produced ads that have a cinematic quality to them.
Because you get to charge more?
Maybe. No, but I think it gives credibility to the message. But the trend now in marketing, and you probably see on your Facebook feeds if you're on Facebook, is not polished selfie ads. So they make them not polished. For whatever reason, that gets a higher click-through rate and a lower acquisition cost. So the less polished ads seem to be a little breakthrough and have a little more resonance than the slickly produced ads.
We could do the whole time just on this and what makes campaign ads effectively. So, but let's now pivot to our next big umbrella topic, which is Fernando.
Can I ask
yes.
one more question? So when you're interviewing a candidate, they're going to work. So going back to campaign spending,
yeah.
What percent of the time is your candidate going to spend on raising money?
I knew you'd ask me this question. Depends on the race. But your standard race isn't going to attract a ton of small donor attention. If you're running for Congress, most people don't care. Unless your race is a top 5 race, then there is a lot of small. If you're running against AOC or you're running against Mitch McConnell, well, okay, you can raise a lot of small dollars. But your standard congressional, people don't care, particularly in a primary. So we sit down and we say, okay, we're actually very, raising money is very formulaic, to geek out for a second. Each candidate we determine, if they're a first-time candidate, we determine within the first week of call time when they're calling donors, they have an hourly raise rate. So your average candidate for a federal race has anywhere from $1,500 to $3,500 an hour of what they make in pledges on the phone. So then we just literally back in. I design the budget. I say, I need X millions. Okay, we're going to need X amount of hours a day, X days a week, and if you give me that, we'll reach budget. So what does that end up being? 70, 80, even 90% of their time will be spent in a room by themselves begging strangers for money.
That line has been pretty consistent since basically the early 80s of congressional candidates spending more than half, well, I should say every member of Congress is a congressional candidate because they're running every 2 years. And so the moment they're elected, the next day, they're calling for the next election, and they spend more than 50% of their time raising money. You know, the question I always try and say to my students is they're not calling a representative sampling for the reason that we talked about in the first slide. They're calling people who have different interests. It doesn't mean their interests are less important. But if you think about what our elected officials are responsive to, by definition, it has to be those people who keep their jobs. Most people like to keep their jobs. I'm responsive to my students. They allow me to keep my job. Candidates have to be responsive to the donors.
You're right, but I also would argue it's not just about job protection. I'd like to think that a lot of people run on both sides of the aisle for a purpose more than a job, that they feel that they're to represent their values of the constituents that they feel that they are more representative of. They have a duty to have the resources to protect their incumbency so they can drive their policy forward. And if they don't raise the money, Jessica, they're out of office and they can't drive their policy forward.
Well,
Yeah, but it's just that stat that you gave us, the percent of the amount of time that a candidate has to spend fundraising, which usually is an incumbent member of Congress, is one of the main reasons I'm for public finance. We elect them to make laws, and a large part of their time they're calling it for fundraising, and so it defeats the whole purpose.
Quick counterpoint to that. One of the reasons I like limited influence of government is because as the role of government becomes more pervasive in our lives, more people have a vested interest in affecting that outcome. So more people are going to spend more money because it affects their businesses and their lives more. So the smaller the government, the less interest they would in having affecting change of the government.
I don't think I understand. I think I won that one by far. It's like, go.
yeah, I'm not going to put my thumb on the scale there. Except to say, so what's the purpose of public financing? Public financing systems come in two flavors. The first is basically matching funds. So you can raise $100 in private donations, you get $200 from the government, or you get $300 from the government if it's a 1-to-3 match. Another flavor of public financing is you can raise $3,000 to show you're viable. Now you get all the money that you need to run your campaign from the government. Typically, there's a trade-off where the government will say, well, you need to then, we'd really like you to adhere to some spending limits. Now, as a result of a number of different Supreme Court cases, I think the way we implement public financing is significantly hobbled. So it used to be that if you were a candidate and you said, I want to raise public funds, then you got more money if we thought your campaign was going to be competitive. How did we know that your campaign was going to be competitive? Your opponent started raising a lot of money, then you got more money. Or an outside group started spending a lot of money, then you got more money. In 2013, the Supreme Court said, no, you can't do that anymore because your opponent is going to want to stop spending, and that means stop speaking if it triggers you to get more money. Or that outside group is going to want to stop spending, meaning stop speaking, if you get more money. So these so-called trigger or rescue fund provisions are no longer part of any campaign finance law, which means that we could give public financing now, but I think that there would be an explosion of private money going to independent expenditure groups. And so to the extent that that trend line that you saw on the graph was something that worries you about outside spending, that would just be so exacerbated by public financing. Now that's public financing in reality. Public financing in the abstract is a really interesting concept, but that's not anything that we can get in our lifetimes. So here's the pivot. We do have public financing in Los Angeles. We have a matching funds program. I dealt with that when I was president of the Ethics Commission. It's, I think, varying degrees of helpful for challengers, and not all that and not used that much by incumbents. So here's the transition. We're voting on March 3rd, Fernando. Tell us, first of all, why are we voting on local races and state races and federal races all on one ballot?
So you're blaming me, right?
We were in favor of it together.
Yes, she was the chair of the Ethics Commission. I was the chair of the Electoral Reform Commission. It actually had a much longer name than that, but I don't even remember it. And we proposed to move the city elections, which were on the odd years, to the even years, and mostly because this is an exact case. If you take a look at the off-year elections for LA City Council, meaning the council districts that are even numbered, which are the ones that are up today, their average turnout in the last 20 years is 11 to 13%. Right? This year, there'll be about 55. What do you think the turnout is going to be on March 3rd in California?
Yeah, I'd say 55, 60%.
Yeah.
And
So-
then November's going to be huge.
Huge, right. Completely different electorate is going to come out. And I thought it was good for democracy in Los Angeles that we have elections where the turnout is. I wasn't increasing turnout. Turnout's the same. I was just saying we should move the election to when people vote. And 78% of Angelenos in a very low turnout election agreed with me and passed that reform. And this is why we now have it. And we will no longer vote in the odd years for LA City Council, school board, or mayor of LA.
I was in favor of that. I got in trouble for being in favor of that.
With your parents?
Yes. They don't like democracy.
Especially when you were a teenager.
So which races are we going to see on the top of the ballot?
The DA's race. Excuse me.
Visually, what are we going to see? And then tell us what's most important.
Okay, well, what's interesting is we have a whole new way we're going to vote, voting centers, et cetera, and there was a law passed, State Senator or Assembly Member Portantino, I forget which, yeah. And so now he had a law that passed, given all that there's going to be so many local elections, that when you go to vote, you're actually going to have the local elections first and the presidential election last. Now, there is a way that when you go, you could actually, because we're going to now vote on what's virtually an iPad, that you could change that around, and you can actually control that. But we have this drop-off effect where we've always put it in order of what we thought was the importance, from president to U.S. Congress, state legislature, et cetera, and you would see a drop-off. Not as much as people argue, but there is a drop-off. And he's trying to address the fact that we're moving so many local races to now the national race to prevent that drop-off and have people vote in that. I kind of agree in principle, but people are going to get frustrated. They're going to open their ballots. First thing they see is, fire district number 5, who are you going to vote for? And so that's going to be, and people will have to learn about how, and this is the first time we're going to vote here in Los Angeles. It's going to be somewhat revolutionary. All your polling places are now changed to vote centers, and we'll talk a little bit more about that. But the change, and then the way the ballots changed, everything's going to change.
You want to say?
One point, and then to your other point, because the impact of what you did by shifting
You mean
the
the
election,
voters of-
your brainchild,
Yeah.
of shifting to the presidential cycle and local elections, actually gives guys like me a heck of a lot more power over the outcome of elections, because you're driving low information voters to the polls to vote on local contests, where if you're a low information voter, you're more susceptible to a marketer. You're less informed, right? You don't read the LA Times. You don't go to community forums. So in a weird way, you've actually allowed influence of money to have a bigger influence in politics. But
I don't buy that assumption, and the reason I don't buy that
there won't be,
assumption is-
but there's more turnout, isn't there?
No, there's much greater
Okay.
turnout.
They're not more informed
No,
than they were.
they are more informed in some respects. It depends on how you define informed, and I would challenge that the 13% were necessarily more informed than the current 60%. That 13% did have a civic engagement attitude, et cetera, but if I were to give them an exam, most of them would fail all the questions just like that 60%. And so because you're much more civically engaged, you intuitively understand certain candidates and voters, but so I think do the 60%. And we're saying 60%. We're not talking about 60% of the adult population. We're talking about 60% of registered voters, which in LA County translates to about 25% of the adult population. That's 25% of the adult population that's going to go out and vote. They're pretty well informed, you know.
All right. I mean, I talk to low information voters every day, but it's pretty scary out there.
All right, so
I mean, if I run an ad saying it's for puppies and kittens, yet it's going to double your taxes, you're probably going to vote for it because you like puppies and kittens, unless you're somewhat informed to realize you're going to pay double
But you're
taxes.
making the assumption that they're going to hear or see your ad. I would venture to say that the majority of these so-called uninformed voters that you're talking about aren't even going to see your ads, or either on television, radio, or print. And when they go and vote, they're going to vote their gut. And in terms of some of the data that we have when we ask, so on March 3rd, I'm going to have 250 students from Loyola
talk about
Marymount
your exit
University
poll. Yeah.
out in 50 randomly selected voting centers. As you come out, we're going to ask you to participate in a survey, and we will give you the survey, and it's self-administered. So if you are asked to do that, please fill that out. By the way, we have an incredibly high response rate. One of our challenges when we do an exit poll is we sometimes have every third voter, and we ask them, and then the second one or the first one says, "Hey, I want to do this too." It's like, no, you can't, because it's a random, and it'll throw off the way we're doing it, and they insist on doing it. So after the third or fourth time we've done that, we've told our students, give it to them, just don't put it in that envelope, put it in another one. Yeah. But wait, so we will, 250 students, 50 randomly polling places, voting centers, excuse me, we will collect about 2,500 surveys in LA County. And they will tell us how they voted, why they voted, and then the voting experience. They'll also give us a ton of their demographics. I can then take that data and make some assumptions saying, this type of voter should have voted for this type of candidate, knowing the demographics of that voter, their income, ethnicity, the geography, knowing what that voter stood for. It's amazing how much it correlates. In my mind, voters, even when they don't have the type of information that you or I would define as informed, intuitively, they know which candidate, for the most part, they know which candidate represents their interest in general.
Well, I love your exit poll, I actually do, so I'm really excited about that. Just last note on the fall off on the ballot, because of the vote centers and all of these things, we don't exactly know how it's going to play out. We, on campaigns, focus a lot, if we're running a down ticket race, on the fallout between who's voting, if it's a presidential year, who's voting in the race for president, and who's going to vote in this county supervisor's race, because everything's about money, and oftentimes is the party that wins is the one who spends his or her money more efficiently than the other. And so we invest in these, they're called predictive analytics models, where I can make some assumptions that your standard political consultant buys a voter file and makes a prediction of whether or not you're going to vote based upon your vote history. If you're voted in the last 4 out of 4 elections that look and feel like this one, odds are voting's a habitual thing, you're probably going to vote in this one. But I can't know from your voting file, I can't know just based upon your voting history. It's harder to predict if you're going to vote in the whole ballot. I might be able to predict if you're turning out, but not if you're going to get to my race. So we use consumer data and all these other data points. It's like 10,000 data points and a large sample poll of about 20,000 people. And then we have these predictive models that'll predict if you're actually going to vote in my race down ticket. And if you're not, and we don't have lots and lots of money to just go out wide, we cast a tighter net to get higher repetitions on the people who actually will vote in our race. Sometimes, depending on the race, we'll be 30% more efficient in our spend than the candidate who just goes out wide. And that sometimes makes a difference.
I have a big problem with that. Number one, if I were John, I would do exactly what he's doing.
I was going to say, you're
So,
I'm a
but
cynic,
the problem I have is that it becomes a self-fulfilling prophecy. You're not voting because people don't communicate to you, so I'm not going to communicate to you, so therefore you're not going to vote. And we have in political science hundreds of studies that show that if I communicate to you the right way, with the right message, with the right messenger, that you will turn out to vote no matter what demographic, no matter what neighborhood, as much as everybody else. But we ignore you. Campaigns ignore you just for the reason that he just mentioned. And he has to do that because of the cost, the short time of the campaign. But for democracy, they continue to have this impact that reinforces the exclusion of the same people over and over. And so somehow we need to break away from campaigns and political parties and have some other mechanism for mobilization, for communication. And that I think would go a long way. Who is that organization? Who is that institution? I don't know. I have some ideas, but that's challenging.
That's something Fernando lets me team teach with him sometimes. And it's something we talk to our students about a lot, which is, everybody talks about, what about the swing voters in the swing states? And that's so important, or the swing voters in the swing districts even. But if new groups of voters came out and stopped this self-fulfilling cycle that Fernando was talking about, it could fundamentally shift almost every election. I always say to my students, which are the millennial voting bloc, if you voted like the 65 and over bloc, you could sway every election. And so that is one of the biggest things. Look, everybody in this room is going to vote. You don't come to a Hammer Forum with this title unless you're going to vote. But it's getting the new people, and you see the candidates, particularly the presidential candidates, try and go for not just kind of the wobblers, because we're so much more polarized now that there aren't as many wobblers, I think, but you try and go for the people who are not going to see your ads because they don't look like they're likely to vote. Okay, we were supposed to be out of time, but Fernando, we have to talk about what's on the ticket, which used to be the down ballot. Now it'll be the top of the ticket. Could you preview a couple of the big local races for us?
I think the biggest races in LA County is, of course, DA. Jackie Lacey is being challenged by Gascon. Jackie Lacey, a progressive African-American DA, is the conservative in this race because there's a much more progressive opponent, Gascon, and an even more progressive other opponent, Rachel Rossi. Only in California is this progressive Democrat the conservative in a race. It's pretty amazing. I think you need, in this particular race, 50% plus one in March wins it outright. There's no runoff. If she doesn't get 50%, there'll be a runoff. It's going to be close. My instinct is that she comes in first, but I wouldn't be surprised if she won it outright. I wouldn't be surprised if Gascon won it outright. And it's going to be it's got national significance in terms of the role that the DA. I don't have enough time to go into it, but it's a.
Do you want to talk a little bit about this new trend towards having new progressive DAs and what progressive DA means?
You're the lawyer.
Well, so I'll say this very briefly, that district attorneys have an enormous amount of influence because they make decisions about setting criminal justice policy, but also on the priorities of what that office is going to charge. For instance, Jackie Lacey can decide that it's going to be a priority to elevate gang murders over elder abuse. And so an enormous amount of resources can be shifted from within the office. If you're talking about the biggest prosecutor's office in the country, which the LADA is, that can really fundamentally shift our priorities. Jackie Lacey has talked a lot about helping people who have mental illness and making sure that they don't become part of the criminal justice system. George Gascon, as you said, is a challenge from the left and is running largely, I think, on the idea that there is systemic racism in the DA's office, and that in the DA's office is wrong, but that there's systemic racism in our criminal justice system, which contributes to the disproportionate number of minorities who you see on death row, who you see convicted for major felonies, et cetera. I'm not the right person to kind of preview that race, other than to say DAs are not particularly visible races. I think people skip over them really quickly, and it's so important to think about who's going to be setting criminal justice policy.
Yeah, just 3 quick points on that. The only debate that happened was with KPCC and the LA Times, and it just broke out into kind of like a mini riot. And the interesting thing was there was a large contingent of African American and Black Lives Matters, and they were totally against Jackie Lacey. And so the idea of ethnic solidarity, et cetera, that not there. Second, the DA is the second most important electoral position in LA County after mayor of LA. Sure, mayor of LA only represents 40% of the county, but everybody still thinks he's the mayor of every city. And he does have the bully pulpit and all that. She is the second most powerful. She's not more powerful than the 5 supervisors combined, but I think she's more powerful than any one individual. And third, we have no public polling on this. We don't know where it's going to go, except that John's going to do a poll.
On Monday, yeah. I run a polling firm, and I don't have a dog in this hunt. I truly don't. So I've partnered with KFI Radio that I work with. Next week, we're going to release a public poll to take a pulse check on the race, because I'm just fascinated as a citizen in LA County of what's going to happen, because this is so important.
Okay, but it's also marketing for you.
Okay, it's shameless promotion, yes. But I'm also interested in what's happening in the DA's race.
Yeah. So the DA's race, I think, is the most important. Then there's some supervisorial districts. One of them is the one with Mark Ridley Thomas is termed out, and he's running for city council. And then we have former president of the council, Herb Wesson, running, state senator Holly Mitchell running, former councilwoman Jan Perry running. And everybody's been talking about those 3. I'm actually going to predict that someone way down that you've probably never heard of is going to come in second, and that is the mayor of Carson, Albert Robles. And simply because of the Latino last name, that district, we consider it as an African-American district. Nothing could be further from the truth. There's actually more Latinos in terms that live in the district by far, but even the number of registered voters, there are many more Latinos. And in this 2018 election, many more Latinos turned out than African Americans, which will be the case also in March. And so many will go out there and just vote for him because of the Latino last name, which I think puts him in the runoff. Yeah, possibly, right? I still think that whether it's Herb or Holly Mitchell that wins, or comes as the other one, will end up winning in November, because they'll have time to define who this guy is or isn't. And that'll make the change. The other one is the city council races in the 12th district, which is out in the valley, where you have a repeat of a special election that had a turnout of about 20%, and now you're going to almost triple that turnout, a completely different electorate, where you really have the last Republican, although he just unregistered as a Republican a couple of months ago, and he's the last Republican on the LA City Council. And we'll see how the Democratic endorsement. So I'll stop there, but there's many more that I can go on.
A couple of really brief follow-up questions. I think this crowd probably knows, but what's the difference between what the city council does and what the county supervisors do?
The major difference, and think about the LA County supervisors, their number one job is think of them as the health department. I mean, that is the biggest budget. That's really the policy area where they really dominate and control. The city council has no control over that. For the city, of course, the number one issue that affects most of us would be public safety, and then land use and all the land use decisions. That's what most cities, that's their 2 most important public policy areas that the state has allowed them to continue to do. The state couldn't overrule them, and that's what the whole SB 50 and all that is about. But traditionally, we have said, let cities, local controls do land use. That's the number one issue that the city does.
And there's 2 ballot measures. If you're in Los Angeles, there's the statewide ballot measure, Prop 13, which is not about Prop 13.
Right.
It's
We
about.
should retire that number. We
I
retire numbers
know,
in baseball.
Seriously.
They should just skip that one,
Yeah,
like
that
you do in
proposition's in the
elevators.
Hall of Fame. You should always you retire the number when it's in the Hall of Fame.
We should do a jersey in the state capitol. So Prop 13 is about whether or not to issue bonds for building. It's actually not building new schools. It's infrastructure for existing schools and to upgrade current buildings, playgrounds, etc. There's a lot more detail to that. And then there's Measure R that deals with whether or not to give the civilian commission more oversight over the sheriff's department. Do you want to talk about Measure R, Doug?
I think the statewide Proposition 13 is going to pass overwhelmingly. It only needs 50%. It does not like a local bond measure that needs 55%. I think the proposition to oversight for the sheriff, I think that's going to pass. One of the things that we're going to do in our exit poll is actually ask the question whether you approve or disapprove of the county sheriff. Ooh. And we'll be able to. I actually think that while many civic leaders are very frustrated with him, that he still has a large support in general. It hasn't filtered down, so we'll see that.
Any?
No, I mean, I'm so excited about the election myself. And then there's a little presidential on the ballot too, which is going to be fun too. But
Yes.
So who's going to win California on the Democratic?
Oh my gosh,
Bernie.
I would say, well, it's proportional, so it's not winner take all in California. It's by
Do you want
congressional
to
district.
actually describe that in a little bit more
Well,
detail?
this is more Fernando's lane. Go ahead, Fernando.
Or do one of you want to describe that in a little
So
bit?
you know how when we have the national election, we say we don't have one national election, it's 50 states in the District of Columbia. It's the same thing we're having in California. We're actually not having, on the presidential level, we're not having a statewide election. We're having 53 elections in each of the congressional districts. And depending on how you do in each one of those districts, it determines how many delegates you will get. Incredibly complicated.
It is, but there's so many delegates at stake in California. It's super important.
But just as I complain about why should Dakota get 3 or the Dakotas get 6 electoral votes when you combine them, is why should a district which is mostly Republican and have the same amount of delegates as a district here where we have probably 5 times, 6 times more Democrats? That doesn't seem fair. We're actually letting a congressional district, let's say.
Well, but it's a closed primary, so the Republicans can't vote for the
No,
Democrats.
right, but there's so many.
It's just number of
proportionate
people.
share of
Share
votes.
votes,
Oh, I see.
correct. So in other words, let's in one of those eastern districts in Northern California, you could have 20,000 Democrats having the same impact as 300,000 Democrats in this district. That doesn't seem fair to me.
Well, the only fun part about that is it forces candidates to go up and down the state versus concentrating in West Los Angeles, which stinks for you guys. But my prediction is.
No, we don't want them here. The traffic. It's just like they add to the traffic.
That's true. My prediction for California would be Bernie will win in a dominant way. It will be Elizabeth Warren's last stand. And I think I could be wrong, but I think I'm right. I think I'm right on this one. It will probably become a Bloomberg, Bernie with a second tier Buttigieg, somebody else contest forward. And the question is, how quickly does the field consolidate? Because we were saying we were talking about this in the green room. Every day this Democratic primary goes on, I think to myself, I'm having flashbacks, like PTSD of 2016, the Republican primary, where everybody kept saying that Trump could be beaten because he's got a high floor but a low ceiling. You know, beyond 28%, nobody's going to vote for this guy. But the field never didn't consolidate fast enough, allowing Trump to consolidate enough delegates that he became inevitable at some point. And people always say, well, if the field didn't like Trump of candidates, why didn't they just all gang up on Trump? Isn't that what they should have done? Well, not really, because my job is to get my candidate elected and make the argument to win votes for my candidate. My job is not to tackle somebody else unless I think it actually sheds votes to me. It's the old prisoner's dilemma, right? Yeah. Which may be happening right now.
Yeah.
Your job is not to uphold American democracy. We got it.
My job is to win elections.
Yeah.
No, my job is simply to win.
I get that, and I respect that. And
You don't have to respect it, but
I was
that's
just going to
what I'm paid to do.
I get that,
you
and I
have to
don't respect that.
it. No.
No, I did. This is what I always say when people ask about, well, doesn't that mean that somebody made a decision as a result of money? And the answer is, and that's the system we created. I mean, so I don't blame anybody who works within the system. I mean, that's why we started with those slides. We created a system where money is one of the most important things. We have to stop. And we would love to hear from you. And I think people are going to walk around and give microphones.
Right. So before the dialogue, when you had the table up, you mentioned the number of Americans, adult Americans, and the percentage of them like contributing money. And it seemed like one assumption was that like it's just the Americans giving the money, or in terms of the political influence. And I'm wondering because there's also a lot of money outside the U.S. and money is a very fungible resource. What have we learned in the past years about money influencing political advertising coming from abroad? And how do you think about foreign influence, whether it's coming from foreign governments or from some political entrepreneurs on their computer in Macedonia or whatever, in the ecosystem of political communication?
So we didn't get to talk about one of the things I really wanted to talk about, which is what do you do with false advertising and fake campaigns ads. It is illegal for any foreign national to contribute money in an American election, but at the federal, state, and local level. But there's a lot of weird kind of wrinkles to that, which is what about a multinational corporation, and are they really being careful enough to keep all their bank accounts separate? So in terms of money, there's a strong bar that says foreign money is not acceptable. If you get it, you have to give it back right away. I think there's a different and pressing question about foreign influence, kind of unpaid or more surreptitious on our elections.
I mean, I'll start with that. Yeah, I have a feeling we're going to go in opposite directions on this one.
You mean you're for foreign money in U.S. elections?
No. In terms of the impact of paid Russian Twitter bots and all this stuff. I mean, I don't like any of it. Don't get me wrong. But to Fernando's point, I think Americans are smart enough to figure it out in a high information contest. In low information contests, it's scary, where the disproportionate influence can happen. But in a race for president, I mean, is there a single American to date that does not have a strong opinion about Donald Trump? Like, it actually lessens the impact that an advertiser, whether foreign or domestic, has on voters, because everybody tunes into the Trump show. I think people are more engaged in the presidential cycle than they ever have been before. So I remain optimistic. I'm not saying it hasn't gone on, and it's gone on a lot longer than happened before pre-Trump. China's been doing it. It goes on. But to the degree we can nip it in the bud, I think that's a good thing. But I still remain optimistic that Americans can sort it out.
Okay. Bob?
A small correction for Fernando. The congressional district in Northern California does not have the same number of delegates in the presidential election as we do here.
Oh, is that correct?
It's a difference between 4 delegates and 7 delegates. But I have a question for John. You said television is king. I TiVo all my programs.
Yeah.
Now, as Fernando and Jessica know, I'm a political junkie. So before the election, the last 2 weeks before the election, when I tape the programs, I skip the programs and look at the political commercials.
Me too. Yeah, me too.
But
I do too.
I think we're in the minority.
That is the definition of a political
You can
junkie.
watch together.
So the question is, how many people skip, now that you can automatically skip the commercials, what percentage skip the commercials? Is that a concern for you?
It is. So the answer is it just becomes a little bit more expensive, and you can't rely upon one mode to reach a voter. So number one, we know who skips and who doesn't, so that kind of goes into our calculation, because we can buy, in some markets, they're called set-top boxes, where I actually can take the voter file, lay it on top of your television systems, and like buy households, so I kind of know who I'm hitting. But that's one of the reasons we buy live programmed events, because local news, live sporting events, people don't fast forward as often through those live events, so I have a better shot at reaching you. But it's all the more reason why you who fast forward through my ads, I might have to track you on Facebook. I might have to hit you somewhere else to get that frequency. But if I love doing this in the rooms. How many people here have seen a Mike Bloomberg ad? Do you know that until like 2 or 3 weeks ago, Mike was only on digital and television? Like, he didn't go to radio. I don't think he sent direct mail. I'm not a Democratic primary voter, but I don't think he's sending. Oh, he has sent direct mail? Okay. But you've seen his TV ads, but you don't consume a lot of TV ads. How'd you get that? Because he did it over and over and over. And if you're walking by a 7-Eleven or wherever it is and there's a TV on, you are seeing a Mike Bloomberg ad. He has that luxury of just being able to, we call it spraying and praying, just doing it everywhere. But anyway, it's harder to track people like you, but we have tricks.
Would you ever peacock and spray and pray at the same
Wow.
Wow.
Okay. People who work with me know I've got all the sayings because they're evergreen. They're good in every cycle.
Or terrible and everything?
Or,
Yeah.
Or amazing.
Yeah. Another question. Yes.
How do you guys see the relationship between paid media and earned media evolving as time goes on? And I both mean that from the perspective of Trump dominating the headlines. He's able to get a lot of earned media in that respect. But I'm also seeing stories this week about Mike Bloomberg in particular paying to work with influencers that would normally be more of the earned media component on social media.
No, I mean, I think the earned media and the Trump effect is like you hit that, nail right on the head. And earned media is always better than paid media. Number one, it doesn't cost you anything. Number two, it's more authentic. So you definitely, and these guys have strategies in terms of how to get that.
Yeah. It's understanding that balance. Like we were talking about earlier in local races, the demise of earned media. It is so hard.
Think about the DA's race. It's one of the most important races.
And that's getting very little coverage.
Yeah.
Your typical assembly race, now that newsrooms have been gutted, I mean, you're lucky to get a dust-up piece the weekend before the election saying, here are the candidates running. There's no flow of the race, which I actually hate because I used to sit around and dream up ways to drive coverage, whether it was for my candidate or against my opponent, or if one of my opponents was cheating, breaking rules, I could get it covered because they were breaking rules. Now I call the LA Times literally with a campaign finance violation saying, here it is, they're breaking the law, it's very clear, it's a $10,000 fine or whatever it is. The Times goes, we don't really have the bandwidth to cover that. So how in the world are voters ever going to hear it? Because I don't have enough money to drive it on television because I've got more important things to do. So the answer is they don't hear it. But to conclude on that point, this is why I'm skeptical of Bloomberg. Because at the end of the day, voters in a high information contest know that it was paid for by. So your ads can frame the narrative, introduce a candidate, build a story around it. But a bad news cycle that comes from earned media can eviscerate all of your gains that I've been doing for months. And we're seeing that with Bloomberg, with the African-American community right now. He's having a bad week. And so the question is, that's not going to change his name recognition, but what does that actually do to the ballot? I think luckily in the presidential contest, it is going to be a high information contest because it rates. People tune in.
All right, we were supposed to end at 9. It's 9:01. One more question. Yes.
Thank you. Could you comment about the influence of dark money nationwide? Is it waning? Are they effective of these laws that we passed in different states against dark money? Where is dark money? How much is it? Is it waning or not?
What's your definition of dark money?
I mean,
Mine is that any Republican who spends it.
It's
We almost made it.
It's
We almost made
conflated. I mean, if I'm attacking opponent, I call any sinistry money as dark money. But to be fair, dark money would be money going through an independent expenditure that's not disclosed, where I can't look up the donors.
Let me do really quickly. So dark money, what do we mean? It's not transparent. It's exactly what John said. So we don't know where the money, it's basically there's a cloaking device. So money goes in from somebody and then it's funneled through a certain type of organization, and then when it comes out, what we see in on the donor list is Americans for Apple Pie. Yep. So why does that occur? It occurs because, for instance, if a super PAC spends money, the super PAC or the PAC has to disclose its donors. But if a nonprofit is actually the one to give to the super PAC or the PAC, then all you see is the name of the nonprofit. And if it's something called a 501c4, they don't have to disclose their donors because those are social welfare or charitable organizations. So a true definition of dark money is really that you're passing it through a type of nonprofit, that what we see is not full transparency. And I'm sorry, please finish.
Well, I actually don't, as just a crass marketer, I don't really care for dark money because there are rules of the kinds of things you can say in advertising when I'm spending dark money. You can't say the word vote for or against. You can't say the date of an election. So you can say, generally you'll know if it's a dark money ad, even if you don't look at the bottom of the disclaimer. If the ad you see on TV, or if you're not watching TV on your tablet or whatever it is, it says, call Susie, whatever, Assembly Susie, and tell her, shame on her for polluting our waters, and they put a phone number up. They know you're not going to call Susie, but they're bringing down your favorables and rising your unfavorables. That, as an effect, it does work, but on the Richter scale of effectiveness, it takes so much more to move the needle. I just don't like it as a marketing tactic, personally.
But that's a little bit the difference between an expenditure and an issue ad.
Right.
Where dark money can be part
You're
of
saying
either
where I
one.
can move it into another committee.
Yes, right. Do you want to weigh in on?
No.
I mean, this is your wheelhouse, mine. But what we're seeing now with super PACs, and this happens on both sides now. This is a bipartisan problem. Is gaming the system. That we have reporting deadlines. I'm sure all three of us will sit there waiting for the reporting deadline to see who has what. You know, I always like to say, I got another corny saying. The grim reaper of a campaign is not really your polling; it's your accountant at the end of a quarter. If he comes in and says we're running out of money, that's it. But what these super PACs are doing now is they're gaming the system where they will not accept a contribution until right before either the close of the period. They try to delay the time to which they have to report the income so that their opponents, that the opposing campaign, can't beat up the group that's received, that's beholden to the Koch brothers or beholden to George Soros or whatever your poison is. So the system gets gamed on both sides.
On that note, thank you so much to my panelists. You were phenomenal. We really enjoyed the discussion. I really, truly enjoyed you being here. I learned a lot. I hope you learned something. And thank you for coming to a Hammer Forum. And feel free to come vote here. I'm just going to come every day that the Hammer Forum's open. And I can vote each time, right? Multiple times?
No.
Yeah, I've heard that's the thing.